J.P. Galen. Here is your first lecture for our independent study, History 4800, Contemporary America, 1945 to the present, which would also be known as the era of the Cold War. Today we are going to be going over Cold War theory and international tensions to have a theoretical background on what it is exactly we're dealing with when it comes to this period of history. The first thing we need to do is to identify three major schools of thought when it comes down to the origins and the dynamics of the Cold War: the Orthodox theory, the Revisionist theory, and the Post-Revisionist theory. The Orthodox theory is one that you are probably quite familiar with, as it is traditionally known as the American perspective. What the American perspective argues, the Soviet Union, by its very nature, is an evil empire. This was a term that was coined by Ronald Reagan during the 1980s and is oftentimes stuck with us when we study this period of history. What we need to understand when it comes down to the origins of this theory is politicians and academics in the West looking at the concept of communism as hailed by Marx and Lenin, that this ideology is inherently hostile to the West. Their evidence for this is that in January of 1918, just at the end of Russian participation in World War I, Vladimir Lenin organized an international group called the Communist International, also commonly referred to with the acronym Comintern. The Communist International referred to itself as the International General Staff of the Class War. What the Comintern was bent on, according to Americans, was to try and overthrow every government throughout the world through violent revolution and through warfare. What many Americans argued then at the end of World War II was that Joseph Stalin was bent upon the idea of world domination, and nothing could stop him unless America took a firm stance. The policies that developed out of these ideas were referred to as containment and the domino theory. People who argued containment, such as the famous diplomat George Kennan, believed that unless the West contained them like a virus, that the Soviets would simply expand and eventually within a few generations expand throughout the world. They argued that the most dangerous aspect of a communist nation is that if a non-communist nation bordered upon it. What they argue is that if one country falls to communism, then any of their neighbors soon will also fall, and that communism as an ideology will spread throughout the world like a virus, and that concessions and negotiations with this virus simply encourage communist aggression. At the end of the day, people who believe in this theory look at Joseph Stalin at the end of World War II and say that he is not a person interested in national security, but that he is simply a communist bent upon ideas of aggression to threaten democracy, peace, and freedom of all peoples throughout the world. The most important thing to understand about the Cold War is that there is always at least two sides to an argument. If we look at the Soviet perspective concerning the Cold War, which is one that's rarely addressed to Americans growing up, the Soviet perspective argues that the West, since day number one of the birth of the socialist movement, has been hostile to the communists. That based upon historic evidence, the West has always been concerned with imperialism, i.e., the idea of conquering and controlling world markets, either through economic manipulation or through military intervention. What the Soviets argued was that the reason why the United States was involved in World War II was simply to crush their imperial rivals, to open up markets, and to try and help our nation come out of the Great Depression. The evidence they used to support this theory is that for the first 2.5 years, yes, the United States was neutral in this conflict because we had not been attacked. And for the fact that we were neutral, it meant according to international law, we could sell arms to both sides. which we did. Once the war was over, with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviets argued since the United States was the only nation in the world that had nuclear weapons, and that they would not share this technology with others, that it was evidence that the United States was simply bent upon world domination, and that the Soviet position was simply a defensive one. When it comes down to economics as well, one of the things we need to understand is that the policies of President Harry S. Truman revolved around both economic and political ones, what Truman himself oftentimes referred to as dollar diplomacy and atomic diplomacy. In the first several years after World War II, it became evident that if Europe were going to survive into the future, that Europe needed assistance. And the United States came up with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is a huge bailout program of economic aid for European nations, where the United States essentially agreed to assist in reconstructing these nations and getting them up on their feet. The problem with the Marshall Plan, according to the Soviets, is that in order to receive Marshall Plan aid, one has to embrace anti-communism. In particular, if you have any communists who have been democratically elected to your own government, that you had to throw them out of office before you could receive American aid. Essentially, the Soviets saying that Americans don't care about European democracy, that they are simply rigging elections in their own interests. At the end of the day, Stalin is going to argue with the revisionist theory that Stalin is simply a nationalist. He's not a communist. That Soviet expansionism is simply a tool of Western propaganda, and that after the loss of 30 million people in World War II, which the Soviets still to this day refer to as the Great Patriotic War, that leaders in the West simply misread Soviet goals and did not understand the nature of what exactly had happened to Russia during the first half of the 20th century. For the fact that through World War I, the Russian Civil War, and World War II, Russia had lost nearly 50 million citizens. This is the evidence that revisionists look for to say that a nation that's lost 50 million people is not bent upon aggression. They're simply trying to defend themselves. What's interesting with the Cold War is it's not an aspect of two sides of a coin. There's a third side to this coin also. What is oftentimes referred to as the post-revisionist stance was made most famous by the linguist Noam Chomsky. What Noam Chomsky argues is that at the end of World War II, too many promises had been made to citizens within each nation of what the world would be like once the war was over. What somebody like Chomsky argues is that both governments, both American and Soviet, had a vested interest in creating a culture of fear within their own citizens. Essentially the idea of creating an outside enemy to try and silence any dissent that occurred within their own nation. And that anything in terms of protecting democracy, spreading socialism, peace, that all of these were simply propaganda slogans to try and simplify incredibly complex issues, to try and control domestic populations. An example of this is that most of the East European communist dictatorships that are created are referred to as people's democracies. In reality, these East European nations did have democratic elections and multi-party democratic elections. It is just that the Communist Party themselves controlled the police force and controlled the army. So any opposition politicians simply kept their mouths shut when it came down to policies they disagreed with. So on the surface, they could keep a propaganda vision of being a democratic nation, while in reality, if your opposition is intimidated by you through force, you can't really call yourself democratic. The other thing to understand is when it comes down to international relations. Both Joseph Stalin and President Roosevelt during World War II had set out a grand vision of liberating all of the colonies throughout the world and to bring an end to European empires, which means a process of decolonization. Now the problem is, once these two powers come into competition with each other after World War II, both of them are afraid that any power that is now becoming independent, a former colony, that if they are able to succeed under the model of the competing nation, that this might create what we would call the threat of a good example. What this means is that both the Americans and the Soviets argued throughout the Cold War that intervention in the affairs of other nations was necessary in order to secure their own security. What Noam Chomsky would argue is that both sides are equally expansionistic, that democracy and socialism are simply a front for both sides to try to justify any atrocity that they commit anywhere in the world. To understand this in a broader context, if you know anything about 19th century European imperialism, when Europeans conquered other nations or interfered in their internal affairs, it was oftentimes referred to as, quote, the white man's burden. What they argued is that these nations needed assistance from the outside, required intervention, because there was something superior about the European nation and inferior about the nation that was being conquered or colonized. Noam Chomsky argues that the same mindset concerning international relations was brought forward after World War II by both the Americans and the Soviets, only instead of using words about civilization, they used words such as democracy, socialism, equality, and peace to justify all sorts of policies that did not actually fall in line with the reality of those words. Essentially, the Cold War and participation in the Cold War is based upon perception. And one of the first things we need to understand about complex political affairs and about the nature of the world itself is that reality is based off of perception. If an individual, a community, or a nation perceives something to be real, for them, that is reality. What we need to understand is both the Americans and the Soviets viewed each other, when it came down to the Cold War, as the main force of aggression and violence throughout the world. American politicians, in particular American popular culture, argued that Russia was simply a warmonger bent upon imposing its system on the rest of the world. What they used to support this, in terms of evidence, is the creation of communist dictatorships in Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe, the fall of China to communism in 1949, and even more so in the early 1950s with the expansion of communist North Korea as an aggressive force trying to conquer South Korea. The Soviets argue the flip side of the coin. For the fact that the United States was only attacked once during World War II at a military base, and had come out of World War II not decimated like the rest of the powers of the world, but even stronger than they had been before the war. The Soviets argued that the United States was the warmonger, bent upon opposing its power on the rest of the world, and in the bigger picture, upon the Soviet Union itself. Both sides had also convinced themselves, in many ways, that the opposing government was not a legitimate government that was actually supported by their citizens, that both nations participated in exploitation of their own people and became expansionistic as an excuse to justify the exploitation of other people. Looking at Soviet affairs, the Americans were convinced that the communists, who formed but a small portion of Russia's population, controlled the government and exploited the society and its resources, not in the interests of the Soviet people, but in their own interests. Despite the fact that people like Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin had used terms such as the dictatorship of the proletariat, which they argued was the creation of a dictatorship that represented the interests of the working class and was controlled by the working class, Western politicians argued that you did not have in the Soviet Union a dictatorship of the working class, but simply a dictatorship of a small, single political party that was willing to utilize terror, dominance, and force to impose its will upon its own people. On the flip side, the Soviets look at the American system and argue that the American system is based upon a capitalistic, militaristic clique that controls the American government, the nation's economic resources, and its media of communication. What they use as evidence for this is that the birth of the United States, yes, very, very few people had the right to vote. In particular, only wealthy white men. And that it took well over 150 years after the birth of our nation to expand out a federally guaranteed right to vote to all American citizens. The reason why the Soviets argue that it took so long is they argue the United States, while it calls itself a democracy, that if you embrace a capitalist economic system, that the reality is it is simply a dictatorship of capitalism. That there's a small group that controls the United States, controls the resources, the finances, and the information, that does not care about their own population, but simply exploits American society and the resources of this nation. Based upon this logic, both sides argue that the population of the other side's nation does not actually support their own government. They argue that these governments are so tyrannical that common people can see right through the propaganda and realize that they are being used and exploited, not protected and supported. The Americans argue that in spite of propaganda, the Soviet people are not really behind their government, that any of their praise of their own government and of the political party of the communists was based upon fear, not actual support. That essentially the Soviet Union, as a totalitarian nation, scared its own citizens into submission, and that these people needed outside intervention to liberate them from a tyrannical government. In much the same way, the Soviets believed that the American people, unlike their own government, want peace. That the American people rejected the ideas of the Cold War, rejected essentially what was the creation of a military-industrial complex, and that the majority of Americans disapproved on American aggression, that the Soviets were bound to, in terms of maintaining world peace, to support any movement within the United States that might help to change government policy or perhaps to overthrow it. Throughout the Cold War, then, the Soviets, in their own propaganda, are going to look to American anti-war protesters to support their propaganda, which in turn is going to cause many American citizens to begin labeling anti-war protesters as communist sympathizers or traitors to their own nation. One of the great problems with trust is it is very difficult to build and very easy to destroy. And it's important to keep in mind that throughout the 1930s and throughout World War II, until the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, both the Americans and the Soviets had held quite a bit of distrust against the other nation, but had for the most part silenced that distrust and set it aside to work cooperatively while Roosevelt was still alive. The Americans argued that the Soviets do not keep their promises, and they do not mean what they say. They argued that any slogans are simply propaganda to try and trick people about the very nature of the Soviet Union and of an international communist conspiracy. That despite any rhetoric about peace or about democracy, that the Soviets simply are liars and cannot be trusted. On the flip side, the Soviets argue the same things about the Americans. One of the problems to understand about the very end of World War II is that when President Roosevelt died and Harry S. Truman, Vice President of the United States, becomes president, that in many ways he didn't keep the promises that Franklin Roosevelt had made to Joseph Stalin. One of the big aspects of this is Harry Truman being under great pressure to take a firm stance with Stalin. That if Stalin was an aggressive man, that the only thing the aggressor understands is a fellow aggressive voice. The Soviets, for the fact that leaders changed, and yes, many of the policies of the United States did change dramatically in April of 1945, that the Americans do not keep their promises, and they do not mean what they say. To extend this further, both sides are also going to argue that the foreign policies of the other side not only are illogical, but that they are simply a product of a mad regime that is bent upon world domination. The Americans argued that Soviet demands on such crucial problems as disarmament, Berlin, and unification were completely unrealistic. That disarmament without adequate inspection is meaningless. That a free Berlin would be equivalent to a Soviet Berlin, and a united Germany without free democratic elections that were oversaw by the international community would be an impossibility if the Soviets were treated as a joint partner. On the other side, the Soviets have some interesting positions as well. The Soviets argue that the American position on such crucial problems as disarmament, East Germany, and China were also completely unrealistic. They always argued that since the Americans were one step ahead of them technologically, that it was not fair or even slightly rational for them to argue that the Soviets should share all of their secrets and open themselves up, which could potentially cause them great harm in terms of national security before they disarmed. And when it comes down to Germany, that if the United States insisted upon a policy that held back particularly on denazification and allowed capitalism to continue going forward in any type of united Germany, that such things would simply lead to the reemergence of a fascist nation and the creation of what the Soviets always feared, a German Fourth Reich. Now, to try and address the importance of this in understanding the Cold War, we will now take a moment to turn our attention to the philosophical and theoretical outlook of Urie Bronfenbrenner. While Urie Bronfenbrenner is not a political scientist and not a historian, he offers a unique way of understanding the dynamics of the Cold War and the dangers of the Cold War. Bronfenbrenner himself is an expert not in those fields of the social sciences, but upon psychology and child development. What Bronfenbrenner argues is an important part of the development of a child is that they learn about the world through simple dualisms, and then as they grow up, they get rid of these simple dualisms and start to understand the complexity of the world around them and the variety of motivations that exist, and that unless one allows oneself to go forward in this process of development and growth, that one will simply always be stuck in a childlike state of irrationality and a worldview based upon emotion and perception, not upon reality. Bronfenbrenner argues, quote, "In war, is it not psychologically necessary to see the enemy as thoroughly evil and to enhance one's own self-image? And are we not engaged in a war, albeit a Cold War, with the Soviet Union? But is not our hope to bring an end to the Cold War, and above all, to avoid the Holocaust of a hot one? And herein lies the terrible danger of the distorted mirror image. For it is characteristic of self-images that they are self-confirming. That is, each party, often against its own wishes, is increasingly driven to behave in a manner which fulfills the expectations of the other." What Bronfenbrenner is getting at is that if you have a simple worldview, a good versus evil, right versus wrong, and that you are putting all of the positive things on your own self-image, and taking all of the opposite negative things and imposing them upon somebody else, that this is incredibly dangerous. What he is also getting at is that humans, cultures, and governments, if you participate in simple dualisms, that you only see what you want to see. That is, that if you impose these ideas upon somebody, that they become self-fulfilling prophecies. And that if you keep arguing that the other side is aggressive and is dangerous, and they believe you are aggressive and dangerous, that neither side is going to back down, and that more and more evidence will continue stacking up that if you embrace this worldview, that the other side needs to be stopped, and that the Cold War, under this psychology, can never come to an end. The great danger, then, of simple dualisms, which is the basis of Bronfenbrenner's mirror image theory, is that words such as democracy, peace, anti-imperialism, and equality are all very powerful slogans that touch to the heart of the human experience in the modern era, but they can all have very, very different meanings. And if both sides are using these words in embracing mirror image theory, then it is quite dangerous, because if the other side's meaning does not line up with your own meaning of the word, one must assume that the other side is inherently lying. Now the question is, when it comes to democracy, is democracy about a political process? Is it about a culture? And if democracy is based upon majority rule, is there a certain social and perhaps economic aspect to democracy. What both sides are going to argue is that they are the power standing for democracy throughout the world, and that the other side, when they embrace the word democracy, is simply lying. When it comes down to peace, both sides argue that they are coming simply from a defensive position, that the other side does not care about disarming after World War II and is bent upon World War III, World War IV, a world of constant warfare and chaos. The problem with this is that if you believe the other side is aggressive and evil, can you allow yourself to negotiate and to try and come to mutual understandings with a side that you perceive to be a threat to humanity itself? Number 3, when it comes to anti-imperialism. Since it was the joint vision of both President Roosevelt and of Joseph Stalin to bring an end to European empires, both sides are going to argue that they are the inheritors of the legacy of the Atlantic Charter. The great danger and problem of trying to understand the anti-imperial position is that we need to understand the British position throughout World War II. Great Britain only participated in World War II to try to protect her empire, and she was surrounded by 2 powerful allies who were dedicated ideologically to the ultimate destruction of the British Empire. And what we'll see from very early on, when Winston Churchill declares in 1947 that an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe, is we'll see the British playing the Americans and the Soviets off from each other to try and protect the interests of the British Empire. And on the notion of equality, are all men created equal, with certain unalienable rights? And if we are, what are those rights? The Americans would argue that the Soviets, with their ideas of economic equality, that things like that do not matter at all if a person doesn't have democratic equality. That the individual needs to have the ability to be in control of their own destiny and to have a nation based on the ability that all people can have an equal voice and therefore have equal access to the fundamental instruments to improve their own life. The Soviets, on the other hand, would argue, do freedoms such as voting or civil liberties matter to somebody if they're starving to death? That one has to embrace ideas about economic equality before one can move forward with other notions about political equality. Where the differences of these words and visions come down to is the competition between Vladimir Lenin and President Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War II. These 2 men facing off against the forces of what we would call Old Europe that had led to the outbreak of World War I. At the end of World War I, Lenin and Wilson are the 2 most powerful politicians in the entire world. What they both agree upon is that World War II cannot happen. And they both have very different visions of how to restructure the world to try and make sure World War II doesn't happen. Now, when it comes down to their ideas, when it comes to freedom, voting, economics, both of these men approach these very basic questions and these problems that had plagued old Europe from very different perspectives. Both are motivated by restructuring and changing the dynamics of the world in order to prevent future war, but both of them have very different approaches when it comes to the dynamics of reform versus revolution. While it is very foreign to the modern American mind, there was a very important period in history during the 19th century and parts of the 20th century when the United States and the Soviet Union, or Russia as it was known in the 19th century, thought of each other as important friends and allies. What we need to understand in a bigger picture, though, is while they considered each other friends and allies, that some of their commonalities from day number one caused some major tensions between both of these powers. What we need to understand is that the birth of the United States was based out of 13 colonies on the East Coast. And the birth of Russia, well, Russia was a very small area to the west of the Ural Mountains. Throughout their history, both of these nations expanded, one throughout the Asiatic continent, one throughout the North American continent, creating essentially multi-ethnic empires and nations. In this expansion of land and of power, what they both did have in common, though, is both the British and the Russians were fearful of British domination of the world. There was a time not so long ago that Great Britain controlled 1/4 of the entire planet. And both the United States and Russia were always concerned about this and concerned about trying to offset British domination. One of the great problems, though, when it comes down to market economies, is once a product has been produced, one needs markets to sell that product to. And when you come down to a global economy, oftentimes nations have cutthroat competition when it comes to dominating and controlling international markets. Prior to the 1860s, with the abolition of slavery in the United States and the abolition of the Russian equivalent of slavery called serfdom, agriculture didn't cost either of these nations much because they relied essentially upon free labor. Once both of these nations chose to start paying their labor forces after the 1860s, or perhaps were forced into this scenario, both the United States and the Russian Empire traditionally have been some of the top suppliers of grain throughout the world. Now the problem is when the cost of labor is going up, and both nations are also competing to try to keep the price of grain up and to control international markets, dynamics of their own agricultural policy are going to have great impacts upon the other nation. In the bigger picture also, when it comes down to China, we must always remember with the American experience, when 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, he wasn't trying to get to America. He was trying to get to Asia. And once the United States was founded, the business leaders such as Robert Morris said, since our initial goal was to get to Asia, particularly to tap into the consumer base of China, that we must embrace the idea of manifest destiny and start expanding out across the entire North American continent all the way to the Pacific, to set up ports there, to set up factories there, and to get across the Pacific to dominate and control the markets of China. Russia has a different take on China, for the fact that Russia has experienced thousands of years of tensions with people referred to broadly in the Chinese Empire. Yes, on the one hand, yes, Russia is interested in trade, but they're also scared about national security. For the fact that under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the Mongolians, along with the Chinese, had conquered and controlled almost all of what we now know as modern Russia. Yes, Russia has a very long history of being paranoid about national security. For the fact that the United States has always had the physical and psychological shields of the Atlantic and the Pacific in the modern era, we have a very difficult time understanding fellow nations when it comes down to issues of national security, because we have not been invaded since the War of 1812. Now, while these nations have some of these commonalities, there's also very important differences. Traditionally, with having such a broad, huge empire with over 150 different nationalities represented, the Russians have traditionally based, even prior to the communist government, a very authoritarian, centralized government to try and keep these diverse populations together. The United States, on the other hand, since the birth of our nation, have embraced a federalist system, where one allows states and regions a great amount of independence as long as they do that independence through a framework that has been set out between the federal government. Essentially, one nation has a very long history of consolidating power into a central authority when it comes down to protecting their nation, and our own nation has a long history of decentralizing authority from the federal government as a way to keep internal peace within our nation. In terms of technological progress, Russia, at the opening of the 20th century, is the most backwards nation, essentially in the entirety of Europe. When serfdom was abolished in the 1860s, Russia never went through an agricultural revolution. For the fact they'd never gone through an agricultural revolution, it also meant that they hadn't laid the groundwork for an industrial revolution. And since Russian farmers were still using non-scientific farming techniques and did not have modern technology, that the great problem facing Russia historically was poor crop harvests and constant threat of famine. While early American colonists, particularly in early settlements such as Jamestown, faced the constant threat of starvation, once the United States was founded, and once we started going through our own agricultural revolution, we very quickly became on the cutting edge of agricultural science and research, which also enabled us to have excess labor force to have the Industrial Revolution go forward. And while Americans still to this day face the reality of starvation at different times, we have never encountered scenarios similar to the Russian experience of having millions of people die from famine when it comes down to a poor harvest. At the end of the day, though, the biggest difference between the United States and Russia, particularly during the 20th century, is when it comes down to national security. The last time the United States fought a battle on its own soil was in the 1860s with the American Civil War. While it was a great blessing that we have not fought wars on our soil since then, the great curse is that Americans do not have a realistic perception of what war is and what the sacrifices of war are. Because our wars always happen overseas, and the troops always get to come back home to a nation of prosperity, and it has not been destroyed. The Russians, on the other hand, have spent their entire history being invaded by outside forces, whether it be being invaded by Germany during World War I, whether it be immediately afterwards in the Russian Civil War, of having Soviet troops fighting against the White Army, who was being supplied and supported by 16 different nations throughout the world, which led to the death of 9 million Russians. Or in World War II, when our allies, the Soviet Union, lost 30 million people and burnt a quarter of their nation to the ground to stop the Nazi invasion. These people witnessed war in their backyards and the destructiveness, which means they have a full-fledged reality of what war is like and the importance of security. What this comes down to then, prior to the Soviet Revolution of 1917 and prior to the Cold War, these two nations oftentimes find that their differences outweigh their commonalities, and that these tensions both sides perceive cannot be overcome. Now that we have a theoretical basis, we will end our lecture today. In our next lectures, we'll be looking at American perspectives on the origins of the Cold War, as well as Soviet perspectives on the origins of the Cold War. And we will find very quickly with both perspectives is they both embrace the same evidence, the same framework, but put very different meaning to that framework, essentially being the embodiment of Urie Bronfenbrenner's thesis about mirror image. Thank you, and enjoy your day.